Your second item, inner alignment, higher level decision making via bottom up phase synchronization. So if you're an agent and things get phase locked so that suddenly there's fewer things you can do, you retroactively say, "Oh yeah, well I made a decision. This is the thing I chose." To me, it seems like an interesting part to place to start. That this whole thing about agency, I chose, I have control, blah 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 blah. It's not. There's something about resonance and the constraints of the physical world that restrict your actions, and you retroactively decide that you made a decision. Does that comport with your thinking? Is it meaningless?
No, I understand the question. I'm I can answer it from the point of view of that particular model, which I think you've seen.
Yeah.
Um, I think that the best that you can, you're talking about free will, right? Is there an option to have made a different choice?
I feel more comfortable with agency.
But only
Okay.
because
All right.
only because why?
Yeah, because that word scares me. I mean, the minute that that's it. We're gonna spend the next 58 minutes talking about what free will is, and that'll be it. So I
Yeah,
value my time with you guys.
yeah.
So
So we can call it agency,
okay.
but the aspect of agency that you're curious about is, could you have chosen otherwise?
Yes. Okay. Fine. Just don't use the F word. Okay, we'll be fine. Please.
Yeah. Uh, so I think about it the way that I think about it in that particular model is that the new higher level collective uh, doesn't have any, couldn't have chosen otherwise. But prior to the new higher level collective emerging, it couldn't choose at all because it wasn't a thing that could make a decision.
Okay.
But becoming a thing which has a sensitivity to an environmental cue that you didn't previously have is as close as you get to free will.
Okay.
There's this thing, and it's out there, and it has the potential to push me around, but at the moment I'm not even sensitive to it.
Yeah.
If I
Yeah.
can organize myself in such a way that I now have sensitivity to that, then I can react to it. I couldn't have reacted differently, but at least I've got myself into a situation where I have a sensitivity to it I didn't have before.
Okay.
It's not everything you want from free will, but it's I don't think it's nothing.
Well, Richard and I were just talking a little while ago about this, and what I think is interesting about that is if you think about so you've got some data moving through an algorithm or a machine or whatever, from the perspective of the data, it meets the Dennett's definition because whatever happens is caused by the content of the data. So I may not have had control over my parts. I am what I am, but the things that are happening in this world now, I caused that. It's because of me that it's happening. So that's
Mhm.
good enough. But I think we can sort of crank it one step further in this kind of self-referential thing and say that, well, sometimes you can have data that changes the data. And so, right, you can have self-modifying, and this is the stuff that I've been thinking about in terms of memories and living things and so on. Then I think you get an extra click on that knob, because if you can, over long term, you can't, none of this works in the immediate, but over long term, if you have the chance to change your own structure and the way in which you are going to then cause the machine to do other things, now you
Yeah.
have more agency, right? So that's kind of a one click up.
Okay. Uh, if this is semantics, we can just stop and switch gears. But you said the data alters the data, but that's an action. So to me, data cannot act. That's why it's data. The minute data can act on other data, it's an agent or it's something else. Or is there a specific reason you're talking about data acting on other data?
Well, the reason is I want to dissolve the distinction, right? I think from one perspective, it's data. And what I'm saying is, if you take the
Mm,
perspective of the data, it's no longer data. It is the agent, right? I'm
got
trying to
it.
that's the part I'm trying to play with. So it
Hmm.
looks like
I'm
data.
not data, you are.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah, I was saying that I've been experimenting with this idea of having observers apply some sort of action to like apply some sort of, for example, oscillation to the substrate in order to see the computation that they desire to see. So instead of just passively looking at a dynamical system to find the result of a computation that they want to see, they for example, in my case, in the experiment that I ran, they just start vibrating a particle at some frequency. So before applying that action, before oscillating a particle, they are not seeing the result of the computation that they want to see. It's not happening in the system. And then they start applying the vibration for a short time. And because of that elastic wave propagating in the material and interfering with all the other mechanical waves in the substrate, it can now see the results of the computation they wanted to see. And so I think that's really interesting to have maybe multiple observers, and then you have to look for these processes that are not interfering with each other. I think that for me right now, that's the biggest challenge, finding these independence between different computations. One of my lab mates here, she was trying to work on it for a while, Piper, and I think that that's the biggest question right now. So yeah, I think that's interesting. And also just instead of, so if you have these observers looking at the dynamical system through a computational lens, one other problem would be to optimize this lens, this computational lens. So not necessarily looking at different frequencies. They can look at different spatial scales, or maybe a mixture of frequencies or something like that. So I think that that's also the next step for me. That's all what I'm interested in pursuing next. Yeah, so just different ideas about the role of observer in the computation.
Interesting. So can I check what you mean when you say the observer, in inverted commas, vibrates something in the system in order to see a particular computation that it does? First of all, I noticed that they're not strictly just an observer if they were interfering with it in that way. Also, I'm interested in the language of, do you mean that because they do that vibration, the system computes this rather than computes that? Or do you mean the system was computing both this and that anyway, but by doing this vibration, they can see this rather than see that?
So in my substrate, it wasn't being computed before.
It wasn't what before?
The computation that they are looking for, it wasn't computed before because it's the result of those waves interfering and mixing with each other that produce the specific response at the output.
So it's almost as though the computation is being done on demand, that because I put this vibration in, that computation occurs.
Yes, yeah.
Which is a way of saying that they are programming it.
Yes, but also the input, it's temporary. So they just apply it for a short time and then they just remove it. And after a while, they look at the response, the output. Yeah, so it's not like the input to the system. So if you assume that we have a logic gate, it's the signal that I'm talking about is not the input, one of the inputs.
Okay, so you have some input signals and then they stop, and then you do a probing signal, and that gives you a particular computation out.
Yes.
Interesting.
Could I ask, are we sure it wasn't doing it before? Because in order to check, you have to vibrate it. So is it that you couldn't see it before, or it really was? Is there a sense in which it wasn't doing it before? I'm not sure about that.
It was latent.
Yeah.
Yes. So before applying that vibration, I can look at the frequency spectrum of the output, and I don't see what what resembles the computation that I'm looking for. That's what I mean by it wasn't being computed before.
Mm.
Mm,
Mm.
yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't
I mean, it's,
completely answer the question, does it?
I mean, it sounds like a way of cheating the and we need Chris Fields here because I'm not an expert in this, but all the quantum observer stuff, right? It's like, was it doing it before you looked? And you sort of try to get a peek at it before actually like really looking, but
Because that's the thing, you do an FFT and you're already choosing the frequency spectrum that you're going to look at. It's not, you're not looking at the infinite, you know. So is it just beyond the edge of the FFT? You know, I think it's impossible to say it's not there.
Mhm.
It's just I didn't see it. If it is there, I didn't see it.
Yeah, I see your point. So maybe it was being computed, but maybe not at the exact frequency that we were looking at. And then after applying that frequency, we can now see the computation. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see your point.
That reminds me of two oscillators of the same frequency that are in antiphase and cancel each other out. And then you say, okay, so there isn't an oscillation then. And then if I take away one of those oscillators, I can see the other one. So it was there, right? So was it there all along, or only there when I looked? And you know, it's not hard to get yourself twisted in a knot there, is it?
But it has an interesting, I think one interesting implication of all of this is that we typically program by asking what can I do to the medium to make it do whatever. And in this case, we're pushed to saying, what do I do to myself to help me see what is already going on, right? It's a different focus.
Yeah, so in between is, so there's what is it doing? What question do I need to ask of it versus what do I need to be in order to see the right, in order to see the answer, or what to, thanks, darling, is that for me?
Yeah, we don't want that.
Or what do I need to be in order to ask the right question?
Mm. Mm. Mhm.
And this relates back to what you were saying, Richard, about the observer not being sensitive to something and then becoming sensitive. The stronger you are as a self, there's a greater range of questions you can ask, more complicated questions you can ask. I like the one about taking away an oscillator. You want to see something. I mean, all of traditional electronics has primed us all to think about technology as restful. By default, it's not doing anything, and you have to add and push. But of course, in the natural world, everything is on all the time. So you got to remove, you got to twist, you got to rotate.
You got to cancel out all of the stuff that's there
Right.
that you don't want in order to
Right.
see.
Yeah.
I
How
mean,
to-
that's exactly how we got Xenobots, right? We didn't do anything to the cells themselves. We took away, we removed the other stuff. We removed
Exactly.
the other stuff that was forcing them to be a boring two-dimensional
You took them out of the Xenobot canceller.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. That's very good. So you can sort of imagine some kind of like crazy, you know, the real cloud, you know, this cosmic AWS that's like everything, we're already doing everything. You know, you figure out how to see it, but then
Right.
here it is.
Yeah. So I think this also relates to Sean's recent paper that I still keep trying to wrap my mind around, is that the way he's posing observers, the observers in his paper are more complicated than what we've done so far. So you have one observer who wants to see things in parallel in space, but sequentially over time. And then there's another observer that is looking for multiple things at the same time, but at different places. You know, so it's not just, I mean, Atoosa's work helped condition me to be like, okay, there can be multiple observers observing the same thing at the same time, but at different frequencies. But it also, you know, there's more sophisticated ways. There's more angles from which an observer can try and make observations, or as Richard was just saying, posing questions. And So Sean's paper made me really think about that. Like, how do we really stretch ourselves and think about the increasingly exotic ways an observer can try and make an observation or probe a system? I think there's tons we could do there.
So that's the question that you put in the chat.
Well, it's related to observers. That's just about, can you have multiple observers in the same place at the same time? But I think then there's a question about, okay, if we're comfortable with multiple observers observing the same thing, how? What are the different? You mentioned rotations, and I don't know if that's what you meant, Richard. But
Yeah.
there's so many crazy ones. There seem to be so many crazy ones that are at least at the edge of my intuition. That we're not thinking hard enough about, the many way. If there's some biological material that's rich, it's got rich dynamics, how much can you pull out of it? You got to be able to look from as many different angles as you can.
So looking at it at a different frequency, that's what Atoosa's work did before, right? You showed me that before. You see different computations by looking at different frequencies.
Yeah.
One can also imagine that there are different computations going on in any one frequency by looking at different phases. So one of my bullets is how to compute XOR with combining frequencies. But when you do that, you're also computing the complement of XOR if you look at the answer frequency, but pi out of phase, you're computing if and only if instead of.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah.
And the way to change the inputs is just to slide a phase difference of the frequency of the input variables to get the combinations of the input variables. So the computing XOR of a particular pair of inputs, you're also computing XOR of all of the other possible inputs you could have. In other words, it's the whole function, not just a function of a particular pair of inputs. And you're also computing the inverse of that function, depending on, because that's also just sliding the function around in phase space as well. But then when you think but being a different phase is really, it's like being a different distance from the source, right? If assuming that your channel takes time, right? Rather than you're looking at it in situ, that you're at a particular distance from the observation. Moving in space then becomes the same. Well, I'm going to see different functions depending on where I am, right? Not just what frequency or phase I'm looking at. And if the function is computed with two different oscillators, I'll do them in plan view, two different oscillators in plan view, then what I see at this distance of this oscillator and what I see at the same distance from this oscillator are different. So as I move around in a circle like this, changing location, I'm changing the phase difference of these two things, which changes which function I see.
Yeah, cool. Very cool.
So my answer to your question is no. No, you can't have two observers seeing different functions in the same place unless those observers are in different places.
I got it.
Because that's the same as being tuned into a different frequency, tuned into a different phase, being in a different location, looking at it from a different angle. They're all interchangeable.
Got it.
Is there any way that an agent's priors alter what's going on? Could you be in the same place right now, but having had a different history? Yeah, and I don't know. I'm just this is I haven't thought this through yet. But the difference is not that you're in a different spot now. It's that you used to be in a different spot.
Yeah.
And now you're interpreting differently.
Yeah. Well, either that means I'm not in the same spot or I'm not the same person, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll take the latter.
Yeah. We talked about that before, Mike, about if we imagine, seems a little bit magical, but if we imagine that it's possible for me to make a decision which alters future trajectories, and if I decide this, then this future will come about, and if I decide that, then that future will come about. Then if I sort of turn that around and look backwards into the past and I have a different story about how I got here, and I got here from this history versus I got here from that history. That's like saying, well, if I came in on this history, I'm going to go out on that future, and if I came in from this history, I'm going to go out on that future, which means that the difference between being able to decide between those two futures is the same as coming from those two different histories. Which means, if I could really believe, if I could really change my mind about how I thought I got here or what I thought my history was, that would be the same as choosing a different future. It's just, it's somehow, both of them are just deciding to be something other than you are. I don't know how you do that. But if you think you can do it about the future, you must be able to do it about the past as well, to just become like, I'm just going to be a different person now. And then whatever that free will I didn't have was going to make me do, it would be different because I just became a different person because I got here from a different history.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really interesting symmetry about, choosing the future requires you to choose an interpretation of the past. But I think that's pretty, I think it's very biological in the sense that, agents having to constantly reconstruct a model of their past from the memory traces that they currently have. And there's your opportunity to reinvent yourself for the future, because you don't actually know what your past was. It's a story that, every whatever 300 milliseconds or whatever it is that you have to cobble together and maintain, right?
Yeah, it's like, so here's my one way, the classical way to view it is, well, here's my history, that never changes. And here's what's happening now. What do I do given what I am? That's determined by my history. What do I do given what's happening now? That's a sort of classical way to think about it. But if instead I have to reconstruct myself from memory all the time, then how I reconstruct myself now in this situation is different from how I reconstructed myself a moment ago or in a different situation, which is like saying the memory was faulty, or it's like saying my history is different, or it's like saying my history is context dependent, it's context sensitive. Like who I am and where I came from is different in this situation than in that situation. What fun.
So the present can push you to be different observers. You can look on your past history. You could look at with different cognitive frame rates. I look back on my history and I see this, which means it's easier for me to go forward in this way because I'm looking in my past in this way. And then a moment later, my now present enforces a different cognitive frame rate on how I look at my past. And I'm looking at the same data, but in a different way. And it suggests it's easier for me to move into the future in this way.
This whole idea of being a self is nonsense, isn't it?
Yeah. It does. It's increasingly untenable to hold up. It doesn't make any sense.
Because, if you put me in a different situation and I do a different computation, then I'm a different me. Or if you just look at me differently, I'm a different me. Like you don't even have to put me in a different, just taking a different perspective on me is a different me. The thing that's weird about it is that it ever feels like a coherent thing in the first place.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's because it takes time to do all of that, right? So it takes some amount of time to like over short enough periods of time, with the perspectives are sort of, they change slowly, they're coherent. Over longer periods they can change radically, as we know from childhood, from metamorphosis, from all kinds of stuff. But in the short term, it takes there's some inertia there, right? There's some.
I'm not sure that even that's true.
Really?
Because the Because if you were to look at it time sliced on a frequency that was twice as fast, then in between you wouldn't be there at all. You know, like if you're recreating your mental state every 100 milliseconds or something, I don't know if that's a sensible number to pick or not, but let's say that, then that feels like it has continuity at that particular frame rate. But in between those frames, who knows what the fuck is happening, right? That might be like there isn't anything there at all.
Well, and I guess it's also okay. It's also held together. Your inertia and my inertia hold each other together because now there's some dependence I can have on the fact that tomorrow, if we have a conversation tomorrow, you're not going to be all about natural selection being the answer to everything. Like I have, so there's some there's some ability I have to know that that's not going to happen, but only right, but only because I
Some
plan
absolute truths, some platonic realities.
right. I mean,
But yeah, but Mike, but that's the thing is if you ask Richard in 8 hours, what's 2 a.m. his time, and he's sleepwalking and sleep talking, you might get that answer, and it's just as valid.
yeah,
Right? You're still talking to Richard, the thing in that bag of skin over there, but it's just at a different time and you're going to get a different answer. But you know that you should probably ask him when he's awake and caffeinated and whatever, and then you know what to expect.
I'm already saying that. I'm already saying that natural selection is the answer to everything, but just you're not tuned into that version of me.
that's what I mean is ourselves, our your inertia and mine are holding each other together.
Yes.
Right, because I'm committed to a certain way of having a conversation with you, and that's what allows us to write a book over the next 3 years. I mean, there's some
Yeah. If you could change quickly enough, you would see that I wasn't consistent.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it comes back to it's not that there aren't selves, it's that what it refers to is a temporary mutual agreement on some inertia about how we're going to measure each other, that kind of thing, right?
But is it useful? I mean, the self to me always advertised like a unity. There's a thing,
Well, that's
not plural, singular.
yeah,
But
that doesn't seem
but if we relax that, then it just, I mean, again, maybe this is semantics. Self doesn't seem like a good word for it anymore. Like, is the best we can do is selves, which implies something very different.
yeah.
Yeah. So there's like a bundle of selves which are not quickly diverging for a given observer, for a given other bundle of selves.
It's a more or less temporary commitment to a perspective, right? It's like it defines a way you plan to observe. You may change that later, but it has some comet tail on it that's not instantaneous.
Yeah. Okay, and so we're claiming now that there is a plurality of things and they stay aligned under certain conditions, under a certain time span. And it seems, again, using that language, that we're implying that it does so more than other stuff usually does. Everything else out there is diverging and kind of more independent, but there's certain things called selves that are, locally aligned in space and time more. Now, is that a reasonable assumption?
Well,
Or, depending on where you look.
Diverge even less, right?
Exactly. Right. So are they more, is selves privileged in any way or not? Maybe it's debased. It's
So you're a self to me. If there are changes that I can do that modify what you do. So if there are changes to my perspective that make you do different things, then you're a self to me.
Yeah.
Whereas to the chair, doesn't matter how I look at it, it still looks like a chair and it still does chair stuff.
Yeah.
I can't look at the chair in a way that makes it do something different.
Yeah.
Let's like get right down to the quantum level, or start like but that's not within my range of ways of looking at things.
Yeah.
But you're a self to me because we're in similar frequencies in similar phases, such that we can phase lock in such a way that you have some coherence, so you at least you stay still for a while, which you would have in common with the chair. But unlike the chair, the range of motion that I have makes you look like you're responding to what I do, have some sensitivity to the kind of things that I can do, that there's a back and forth.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a metric here, something related to the cognitive light cone, and you're a self to the extent that there are some radius of bundles of things that I think we can relate over and goal directed and whatever. But I would be really careful with the chair thing, in the sense that, I mean, yes, clearly a chair is at a different level and everything, but what I take away from the stuff that we've done on the memory and gene regulatory networks and some of this new sorting algorithm stuff is that things that look like a chair from one perspective, I mean, they're not going to be you, but they're not quite a chair from other perspectives, right? So if you
Sure.
right, if you look at the GRN in the right way, you start to see, okay, there's some learning here and some other stuff that, right? So
yeah. So I didn't mean to be chairist.
Yeah, right. I was very cherished to be.
So all I'm saying is I don't know how to look at a chair in such a way that it does something different, but maybe a chair does, right? Maybe a chair knows how to look at a chair in such a way that it does something different.
Yeah.
And then it would be a self to that observer, but it's not a self to me, right? But that is an observer relative.
Yeah. It's your failing, not the chair.
Yeah.
So for selves, there's some sort of Goldilocks zone. You can't be too integrated and you can't be too divergent and independent. I mean, to me, it connects back to embodiment and empowerment in particular. There's certain actions you can do that pull apart the strings for decohere something else, give it a little bit more independence, or hold it still for a while. That's an important aspect of selves.
Can I tell you about the repeatedly recreating the conditions for its own origination?
Sure.
So a biological self that I'm imagining now going through multiple lifetimes, a lineage going through multiple lifetimes, development, maturity, death, birth again. You can think of that as a cycle, which is just going around and around and around. If you think about it as a cycle that's going around and around, then that means that the information at any one point in time on any one point on that circle is actually the same as the information on any other point in that circle, because otherwise you couldn't get back to where you were. If you lost information as you went around, then you wouldn't be able to get back to the spot where you started, right? So there has to be the same information there in the adult form as there is in the embryonic form. It's just expressed differently, right? You're just looking at it differently, or it's expressed differently, or it's in a different form. But it feels like the selfhood comes and goes. That when I have an embryonic cell with its genome, not much of a self there. But when it's in its adult form and it's walking and talking, well, I think there's a self there, and then it goes away again. So how can I reconcile this idea of the selfhood coming and going, whilst I know that it's a cycle which is perpetual, and so the information must be there all the time? And the way that I have come to reconcile that is to imagine that you have a cycle which is resonating with other frequencies, so that you have an oscillator that resonates with other oscillators, but they're not at the same frequency. It's this harmonic oscillation. So, for example, it can oscillate with something that's half the frequency, a longer wavelength, or twice the frequency, a shorter wavelength. And the information that's carried on the focal frequency that you started with gets pushed out onto these other frequencies above and below. And that means that the information at this frequency that you were looking at appears to have gone. And then it gets pushed back again from those two frequencies back to the focal frequency.
Yeah.
So it appears like you have a system which is there, and then it's not there, and then it's there, and then it's not there. But that system was creating these vibrations in its environmental variables and in its genome, levels of organization which are sort of not the level of organization of the organism, of the self that my self sees.
Yeah.
They're pushed, they look like they're sort of universal constants, like, that they're environmental constants which don't look like a self at all, or they are high frequency vibrations that just look like noise. Depending on, if you can push them very far away in frequencies, then they look like they're not there at all. But actually, there's a coherence between them because they were created from the same source. There's a coherence between them that necessarily recreates the original, that memory is recreated.
Yeah.
So if you take a step back from that whole thing, okay, so that's a cycle then, right? So that's a cycle which is, coming in and out, and yes, that's fine. And if you want to see that come and go, then you have to step back another sort of frame of reference in order to see that. But the point is that there's an observer-dependent way of looking at it, which makes it look like a system which comes and goes, a system which repeatedly recreates the conditions for its own origination, which is different from just persisting, just going around, right?
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I think that I can do that in very simple form. It's a bit like it's related to Mike's bow tie stuff, right? Because I had this idea that whatever the information is that you're interested in order for that to not just be a sort of one-to-one imprint or memory in a boring way, it has to be compressed and then expanded back again. Because when you compress it, then you can do generalization that when you expand it back again, you don't necessarily get the same thing. And that's important because otherwise you're not really doing learning, you're just doing memory, right? But I realized that wasn't enough, because if you compress it a lot and then expand it back a lot, it's now become like, now it represents almost anything, because you compressed it so much that you lost all the information, right? So how do you get this balance between, I want to do a lot of compression because I want to have generalization, which is non-trivial, but I also want to be able to do recall, which has high fidelity, so that I'm not just generating everything from the class of all possible things, right? Because otherwise that's not a memory at all. And the way that you do that with frequencies is that you take two different harmonics. So you compress it with one harmonic, for example, the octave, which has a 2-to-1 ratio, but you also compress it with the perfect fifth, a 2/3 ratio. And when you project them back again, they're both ambiguous, but the ambiguity resolves in a way that gives you one perfect memory again. So it's like taking stereoscopic vision, right? That with one eyeball, I've lost the depth information. So I compress 3D down to 2D. But if I have two eyeballs, I can take two different perspectives, and that enables me to recreate the third dimension that I'd lost. So when you do that resonance on different frequencies, you can't just do it on one frequency or an octave and an octave and octave and octave. that would give you lots of compression, but then when you push it back again, you wouldn't know what was the original, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if instead of just doing it on one, it's not just one frequency, it's almost like one harmonic stack, like octave stack versus the perfect fifth stack. They give you a way of compressing it in from two different perspectives. That when those two different perspectives are brought back again,
Yeah.
to one place, you get a proper recall, and then you can do, I believe, you can do generalization, which is non-trivial, but you can also do specific recall. So that it's not just a sort of that you have to sacrifice fidelity in order to get generalization, because you don't want to do that, right? I want to be able to recall really specific things, but I also want to have a really deep generalized understanding of them.
And the ability to juggle in that manner is what makes selves special. I would think,
Yeah.
right?
So if I wanted to recover the event which caused those two memories, I have to be at the same position that generated them, right?
Yeah.
Because if I don't know, it's like saying, if I don't know where my two eyeballs are, I can't recover the third dimension.
Yeah.
Like I need to know something about the point of intersection of those two perspectives in order to get the memory back. Otherwise, I'd get some other memory back if I didn't know how they related to one another.
Yeah.
Two quick things. One is it's interesting you say that. I was thinking about our tadpoles with the eyes on their butts,
Oh yeah.
right? So evolutionarily, their eyes are absolutely not where they have been for the last however many millions of years.
Yeah.
Of course, we don't know what we know they can see, and we know they can see usefully and adaptively. We don't know what they see.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of work on human sensory substitution and sensory augmentation, and then people can sort of tell you what they see with these weird weird devices and different modalities that they get connected to. So I think that's interesting. The plasticity of how fast you adapt to changes in exactly what you were just saying. The rubber hand illusion thing, right? 6 or 7 minutes of experience overrides millions of years of being a tetrapod, knowing exactly how many limbs.
Give me a second, Mike. Do you want me to go to the kitchen? Yeah. Yeah. That is extraordinary, isn't it?
It is, right? So that's the thing about these, being a living observer, is you're so ready, and I think that's what explains developmental plasticity and Xenobots and all of this stuff, is that you just don't take the past all that seriously. You are very willing to reinterpret what's going on. I mean, most of the time it happens the same way, but if it doesn't, no problem, because you weren't expecting that in the first place. You were making up a story to begin with.
Yeah, but you haven't forgotten that it's a hand, or that hitting it with a hammer hurts, right? So there's lots of depth to the concepts that you're holding on to. Just you project them onto something else.
When when people get and I mean they've now done all kinds of weird sensors and effectors, but just the simplest thing is when you get a prosthetic hand where the hand can rotate 360 degrees, which our hand does not do, very quickly people learn to do it that way. When you reach for a coffee cup, you go and you rotate it the wrong way. Your hand never ever used to do that, but no problem. It'll get incorporated, right?
Very simple examples were the goggles that turn your vision
right.
Yeah.
But Mike, your hand used to be half the size it was, and a quarter of the size it was, and an eighth the size. So, I mean, maybe not rotations, but there was enough spatial transformations of your hand in your own lifetime, literally, that, suddenly rotating 360 degrees, that's a mild transformation based on all the ones you've actually experienced firsthand.
You know what I can't do though? I can't use tweezers to pluck my eyebrows when I'm looking in the mirror. Is it closer? Is it for? Oh,
Yeah, that's hard.
We'll work on that. We'll add it to the list.
I know. I just like, oh, come on. I should be able to do this. It's just the opposite of what you're thinking. Come on, you can do it.
Yeah, have you ever seen those bicycles? They put one thing on the steering wheel that it
Yeah.
goes
Oh,
up,
yeah.
right? It's hard, but people do learn. I mean, the other thing about the selves, right? We were talking about the self. I think another interesting thing about the self is the self-referential thing that Hofstadter was always talking about, which is what's cool about the self is that it actually has a perspective on itself, right? So it's not just that we can look at something and see what we see, but it is doing it to itself, right? That's I don't know if that's a phase transition or if that's perfectly smooth with chairs and whatnot, but I think there's something there, right? To systems that actually also interpret themselves.
Yeah. So mostly thanks to Atoosa, all I do is think about vibration these days. Is there something special about that modality? Like I feel bad for heat and for light and for electricity and for, mechanical, shear forces and like, is it just because that's what's cool these days, or is vibration really it? Like Rich, your song of life, is it,
Yeah, no, I think
we should have been focusing on vibration all that. We got distracted by electricity, after the Second World War, but
well, I think that pertains to everything is a rotation, and agency is just the right amount of late.
is just the right amount of what?
Late.
Late, got it.
So the thing is that if you take it that the thing that you really want to explain is agency, not free will, we don't do that. And what you mean by that is that instead of being a consequence of actions that happen to you, you want to take actions because of their consequences that haven't happened yet. You have to turn that whole thing around.
Yeah, yeah.
This action occurred because of its consequences, not these consequences occurred because of those actions.
Yeah.
That's the thing that makes agency weird. And the way that you do that is you say, well, look, if there's something which is happening at a regular interval, and there's a consequence of that, which happens with a little delay, then if the delay happens to be just a little bit less than the period, it ends up looking like the cause and effect is the other way around. It's related to the phenomena of the rotating wagon wheels on spaghetti westerns when you watch them on TV, that occasionally the wagon wheels look like they're spinning the wrong way, right? They look like they're spinning backwards because of the stroboscopic effect, right? So if you're just the right amount of late, then it looks like that you're coming before things rather than after things. Instead of being a reaction which happens afterwards, you appear to be a cause which is happening before. Now, but if the world really is, everything really is a rotation, and that's not just appears to be happening before it, it is happening before it, right? There isn't, if the world really is a rotation, there isn't you can't attribute cause because A happens before B rather than B happened after A, but that's just not relevant if everything is really a rotation. So that's the reason, that's one reason why I think vibration is the thing, right? It's because you want to have a circular notion of cause, because without a circular notion of cause, you're never going to get to agency. You're never going to break that. Let me put it differently. When you have a linear notion of cause, agency is always going to be mysterious. When you have a circular notion of cause, it's possible to let go of your notion of time going in a particular direction and just accept that these are all part of a cycle.
Yeah.
And that they all have the same amount of causal power of every other part of the cycle, right? Because in so much as they are a cycle, all points on that cycle have the same information about all the other points on that cycle. There's no one part of it which is causing the rest of it, right? So that's one reason why I think it has to be about vibrations, is because it's about rotations. It's about cycles.
I see. That's what's so important about vibration.
Yeah.
Interesting.
The other thing that I think is important about it is harmonics. That the symmetries that you get from doubling the frequency and doing other ratios of the frequency.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing special about doubling or taking thirds when you're doing in a linear system.
Yeah. Right.
Why cut it up that way or cut it up that way, right? But
yeah.
when you take a circle and you pinch it in half and you fold it over, that's a way of getting a correspondence that's natural for the size that you started with. But there isn't, in a linear model, there isn't really any particular size.
That's interesting.
Yeah, in a linear model, it's like, why is that a unit?
Yeah.
It's like I could have picked any unit I liked, but for a cycle, it's like, no, that really is a unit. Then all the other units are defined from there, that it's a half or twice of that,
So if all those symmetries are useful and we're starting to look at computation in vibration, are there natural symmetries there that have yet to be found? So if you can find a NAND at this frequency, you're likely to also be able to find an XOR at double the frequency. That it's not arbitrary where you look if you're treating what you see as computations. I wonder if there's some mapping there, some structure. You'll always get, when you get a computation here and there, you're always going to get something.
Yeah. So in a sense, that question is about what are the natural laws of induction in that space? What are the natural kinds of interpolation and extrapolation, right?
It's not all arbitrary. You can try and force it, and it's arbitrary if you do it without vibration, but if you do it with, you can, there is that latent structure, and you might be able to exploit it.